Who are you? How do you define yourself? What is your identity? Pretty important questions, right? I think it's interesting that as we look at the culture around us, the question of identity and how it is formed is one of the biggest things we're talking about right now, whether it's with regard to sexuality, with regard to race, nationality, personal successes. Identity is huge for people. Identity has been determined across cultures, times, and peoples in a variety of ways. In the olden days, you were functionally what other people said you were. You had a duty to your community. There wasn't any striking out on your own to make a name for yourself. You had a duty to your family and the family trade, and that was all there was to it. Today, we bristle at that idea. That is as modern day Americans. As modern day Americans, we say we want to chart our own destiny, discover ourselves, and write our own story. Our identities are not given, we say, they're made. And so as a result, people decide their identity based on their vocation or their sexual orientation or their ideology or the acceptance of someone in their life, and on it goes, the sources for our own identity. And so generally speaking, we could say that our identity is either determined by others or it's determined individually by influences we choose. However, Christianity says our identity is not determined by others or ourselves. Instead, it says that our identity is gifted to us by God Himself. In John chapter 1, verses 12 and 13, it says, "To all who did receive Jesus, who believed in His name, He gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." And this is huge. What this means is that there is no worldly force that determines who we are, but God the Father, through His Son Jesus, names and claims us as His own children through the power of faith. First and foremost, Christians identify as being children of God. And of course, there are other influences on a Christian, but her identity is primarily rooted and centered in being God's daughter, or if you're a guy, being God's son. However, that raises a good question. All of us have, so to speak, a deck of cards. Each card is an influence on our identity, and sometimes those influences compete for our attention. So for example, being one of God's kids, we have the promise that we're accepted and loved unconditionally. However, as anyone who's been a Christian knows, there's plenty of cards that try and persuade us to doubt that love, to doubt our identity as God's kids. And so, are there some other cards with which we can stack the deck, so to speak, to give us assurance of our identity as God's kids? Well, I'm glad you asked that. It's a really good question, because there is. Your faith has given you a means to remind you and assure you of your identity. And that's our paradigm we're looking at today. And that paradigm is called the means of grace. So what is meant by the phrase means of grace? The phrase means of grace refers to the two sacraments of the Christian church, baptism and communion. And before we go any further, I need to pause for a second. Of anything in all of Christendom, the sacraments have been both the thing that all Christians have in common and also the thing that has caused the most division, ironically. And ever since the Reformation in the 16th century, Protestants have charted their own course away from the Roman Catholic understanding of the sacraments, and that's caused some significant conflict and division and all this sort of stuff. And so questions like these are asked: does baptism save us, or is it an outward symbol of an inward change? And is Jesus really present within the bread and wine, or are they just symbols? And these questions have been argued about before now, and we'll probably still be arguing about them until Jesus returns. And depending on your background, you might have a strong opinion about this too. And I could talk about all the similarities and the differences, write a nice compare and contrast paper for you, but that's not the point of what I want to get across today. Miles Square Church is simply rooted in the teachings of the Lutheran Church. And it's those teachings that I'm going to be expressing in this video. And what I love about the Lutheran tradition, the Lutheran understanding of the means of grace, is this: Lutheran Christians believe the means of grace are rooted in God's Word and grounded on His grace. And as a result, they are powerful reminders and assurances of God's unconditional love for us. So let me start by first defining what is meant by the term sacrament. The word sacrament comes from the Latin word sacramentum, which means mystery. And as we continue further along, you'll see why that's a really good word to describe the means of grace. But the reason why the sacraments of the Christian Church are communion and baptism are because they meet certain qualifications for what a sacrament is. And so in order to be a sacrament, we say it needs to have been instituted by Jesus' command, bring with it the promise of grace, and it needs to have physicality, something you can touch and feel, taste. And so if we look at both baptism and communion, we see they meet those requirements. For instance, baptism was commanded by Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28. It brings with it the promise of forgiveness and cleansing from sin, and the physical sign is water. Communion was also instituted by Jesus at the Last Supper. It assures us of a forgiveness, and the physical signs are bread and wine. And so now if you're a Christian from outside the Lutheran tradition, or maybe you're still trying to figure this whole Christianity thing out, you might be wondering exactly how getting splashed in water or dunked in water or eating a bland wafer and sipping some wine can do such amazing things that I just said. Forgive sins, really? And honestly, I think this gets into for the means of grace. Christians over the generations have tried to figure out how the sacraments work, or how it's possible that baptism saves, or how it's possible that Jesus' body and blood are really present in the bread and wine. Lutherans are just the weirdos that have decided to let the mystery remain a mystery. It's not intellectually satisfying. If you're looking for intellectually satisfying things, you might want to go explore something else. But we figure God isn't intellectually satisfying most of the time, so why should his gifts be? The promises God gives us in the means of grace are just to be trusted by faith. And as Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. But here's why I think the means of grace are so cool. Every Christian tradition believes we are saved exclusively through faith in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And usually that experience of faith is an internal experience. It's from that experience you receive your identity as God's kid. His promise of love and forgiveness is constant towards you. That's a promise. However, there are times when that identity can feel like it's drowned out by other voices competing to form your identity and sense of self-worth. And it's during those times when the means of grace are such gifts, when your identity as a child of God is being shouted down by other voices, the means of grace provide an external source of assurance of God's love for you. And maybe those voices can accuse you. Maybe you feel like you've sinned too much this time for God to forgive you. They discourage you, making you question if God even loves you at all. They try and deceive you and pull you away from fully grasping your identity as God's child. And whatever those voices try to do, however they try to compete for your attention, the means of grace stand as physical, real-time encounters with God's promises, love, and grace. So when the devil tries to make you question God's love or question your identity, you can point to your baptism. For me, I was baptized June 30th, 1991, and on that day, God reached down, named me, and claimed me as his adopted son. I have a historical external reference point to look at to assure me of God's love and acceptance. And the same thing is true with communion. Every time I eat and drink the bread and wine, I believe I'm having a real encounter with the presence of the risen Jesus, with his body and with his blood. And when I eat and drink, I believe in Jesus' words, just simply what he says. This is my body. This is my blood, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. And so I can literally taste and see that the Lord is good. The means of grace are physical, objective, real-time encounters with God's love, and God has given them to us because often it's very hard to actually believe he loves us as much as he does, especially with all the other things competing for our attention. Now, I've kept this teaching short. This is all I'm going to say right now. And I didn't quote the Bible a lot. And the reason for that is that you're going to do the legwork. At this time, you're going to open the scriptures and you're going to see that the sacraments, these mysteries I've described as a great comfort, aren't something I've just invented or that has come from the traditions of the church. They're right there in God's word. And maybe this teaching has raised some interesting questions for you, and maybe you're hearing something about the means of grace that contrasts with what you've understood about communion and baptism before. And if that's you, that's okay. And if you've never even explored this idea of the means of grace, that's great too. It's safe to ask questions and wrestle with this stuff. But my hope and prayer is that as you open the scriptures today, that you'll see the kind of confidence this paradigm can offer you and your sense of identity. So may God bless your reading of His Word and your discussion today.